guys, and welcome back to science class. I'm sure that you got the message from Miss Shepherd about our classes changing their format. From now on, you're going to have science Mondays and Wednesdays. So I will only be posting 2 assignments per week. And then on Friday, there'll be an opportunity for you to make up any work that you've missed for any class. And sometimes I will also post an enrichment activity, something you can do for fun. You won't be penalized if you don't do it, but if you do it, you'll get those extra points. So what I'd like you to do for a second is I'd like you to think about a relationship that you have with another living thing. This could be a friend, it could be a pet, it could be a family member, anything that's alive besides you. And I want you to think for a second, what do you get out of this relationship? And what does this other person or living thing get out of the relationship? So take a second and think about that. Okay, so I'd like you to write the answers to those 2 questions for me right now. Okay, so when we talk about living things, all living things have relationships to each other, whether you're talking about relationships to other animals of the same species, so like my relationship with you, or whether we're talking about relationships between species, like your relationship with your pet. We all have interactions with each other. We have been talking in ecology about how ecosystems work, about food chains and food webs and energy, and all those things are incredibly important. Now we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the relationships that organisms have with each other. So, for example, I have a relationship with my plants. You might not think it's much of a relationship, but the relationship I have with my plants is I take care of them and I give them water and I make sure that they have fertilizer to help them grow. So they get that from me. And in return, I get the pleasure of having them in my home. They make me feel happy and relaxed because of all that green. And so that is a relationship right there. And in this relationship, we both get something. I get something from the plants in the pleasure that they give me, and they get something from me in that I give them resources that they need to survive. In nature, organisms can have one of several types of relationships. But ultimately, when we talk about these relationships and we talk about what can live someplace and why, and how much of them can live there. Whenever we're talking about something that can limit the amount of organisms that live in an area, for example, in my apartment, I can only have a certain number of plants because there's only a little bit of space where the plants would be able to get enough sunlight to grow. And I don't have a lot of room for that. So that limits the number of plants that I have in my apartment. So we call these factors that limit how many organisms can live in an area a limiting factor. So take a second right now and write down some things that you think could be limiting factors, something in the environment that could limit, control how many of an organism can live in that place at that time. Okay, so some of you might have written things like food, the amount of food, or the amount of water, or the amount of shelter. If we're talking about plants, the amount of sunlight, the type of soil, whether or not there are predators that eat them. So there's so many things that can control how many organisms live in an area. What has to be important about a limiting factor is there's not a lot of it. A limiting factor is limited, meaning there's a little bit of it. which means that everyone has to fight for the little bit that's there. So I want you to take a second and I want you to think, what would be a limiting factor in a desert? If you said a limiting factor in a desert would be the amount of water, yeah. Sunlight wouldn't be a limiting factor because there is going to be lots of light in a desert. Temperature isn't going to be a limiting factor. Oh, I forgot to add that to the list. But water is a big problem in the desert. There's not a lot of water. And so the amount of water is going to determine what can live there and how much of them can live there. The idea of a limiting factor is the limiting factor can decrease the size of a population of organism in any area. They control how many of them can live in that area. So what kind of biotic things do you think could affect an organism's survival? If you guys said a predator could do that, yeah. There's 5 kinds of relationships that organisms have with other organisms. The first one we're going to talk about today is competition. But we already learned about predation. Predation is when one organism eats another. We learned that. Parasitism, mutualism, and one you've probably never heard of, commensalism. And we're going to spend the next 2 classes talking about these. But today we're going to focus on competition. Now, competition is when organisms are fighting over a limited resource like food or water or shelter or mates. So there can be competition between 2 animals of the same kind, like these 2 deer right now are competing. And in this case, these 2 male deer, these boy deers, are competing with each other for the girls. So in deer, the males will fight each other to show which one is the strongest, and then the strongest male is most attractive to the female. So they're competing over the limited resource of mates, of females. Over here in this picture, we see a lion and a hyena. Lions and hyenas are different species, but they both compete for food. And in fact, in the wild, lion and hyenas are enemies. They don't get along because they both have to fight for the same limited amount of food. They both hunt and eat the same types of animals, and there's a limited number of those animals. And because there's a limited number of those animals, the lions and the hyenas not only have to fight each other for the amount of food, but sometimes they have to fight with their own species. So lions have to fight with other groups of lions for that food. So let's reflect on this for a second. Okay, well, the answer is 1, a continual input of energy. We're always going to need more energy entering. And hopefully you remember this. Why do we need more energy? Because energy is lost as heat. So because energy is constantly being lost to the environment, we always need to have more energy coming in. In this case, energy would be sunlight, and then the sunlight goes to the plants. Now, we wouldn't want to have limited autotrophic nutrition. Limited means not a lot, and autotrophic nutrition means plants. We want to have lots of plants because those plants are what are making the food for all the organisms. So we want to have lots of plants. More plants is better. Limited means there's not a lot of plants. If there's not a lot of plants, there is not a lot of energy, which would be a big problem. As far as no competition between species, we can have competition. But we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about how that competition has to work in an ecosystem. In order for an ecosystem to be balanced, there can be competition, but the competition has to be balanced between the species. No 2 species are going to be able to live in the same place at the same time and use all the resources in the same way. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay.
Old shells are highly prized. And this one is occupied by a sarcastic fringe head. These fish are exceptionally quarrelsome. They have to be to defend their living space. An octopus. Inadvertently, it's wandered into the fringe head's territory, and that can't be tolerated. The octopus's impressive jab holds the fringe head at bay. There is more to this behavior than being bad-tempered. The fringe head needs to defend its patch if it is to get enough to eat, and the octopus was competition. Crabs are not the easiest of mouthfuls. Because of the shortage of living space, there are constant boundary disputes, especially with other fringe heads. And this one has got too close.
Uh-oh.
Despite the most extravagant threats, neither is prepared to back down. Success, and it's quick to get back to its shell. A fringe head can never drop its guard. There's too much competition.
Okay, so that was really cool, I thought. So what you saw there is that the fringe head, the fish, had to defend its territory. It had to defend the place where it lived against other animals, not just the octopus, not just other species, but also individuals of the same species, also against other fishes just like itself. Now the reason why they had to fight each other is they were like, this is my home, and this is where I'm gonna eat, this is where I'm gonna drink, and you can't come here. And the reason why is because there's very little food, or there's a limited amount of food. And so by defending its territory, by keeping other animals out of its territory, it's protecting its home, it's protecting its food, it's protecting its ability to stay alive. And it constantly has to watch out for other animals trying to sneak in and steal its territory, steal its food. So that's what competition is. Competition is fighting for resources.